son-in-law punched me in the face. My own daughter dragged me out by my hair, all because I said no to giving them $1 million. I sat on the curb, bleeding, shivering, and wondering when my child became someone I no longer recognized. But what they didn't know was that I had already prepared for this moment. And 1 hour later, everything began to fall apart for them. I moved in with my daughter, Lena, the week after I turned 70, not because I couldn't live on my own, not because I needed help climbing stairs or remembering names, but because she said she missed me, said she wanted me closer, said her husband, Mark, even agreed. At the time, I thought it was love. I didn't realize it was strategy. Their house sat on a quiet street outside Cedar Ridge, with a wide porch and a white swing that never got used. Lena had decorated the guest room in lilac and ivory, my favorite colors. There were new sheets on the bed, and a framed photo of us from her college graduation sat on the nightstand. I remember standing there, suitcase still in hand, thinking, maybe this will be good. Maybe this will heal the distance between us. It wasn't like I had nowhere else to go. I had a small apartment 2 towns over. I worked part-time at the public library, organizing historical archives and leading genealogy workshops. That work meant something to me. So did the quiet of my own home, my little kitchen, my ceramic owl salt shakers. But Lena said she missed dinners with me, said she wanted her kids to hear my stories. I believed her. The first week went well. She made me tea each night before bed. Mark asked about my old job. The grandkids sat at my feet while I told them how our ancestors came over from Wales. I felt almost foolish for having doubted her. Then, gradually, small things changed. Lena started bringing up bills more often. Her voice was light, but the words were weighted. She talked about refinancing, about college savings, about how tight things had gotten. Mark mentioned an opportunity through one of his clients, some real estate fund, high return, low risk. He said it casually over dinner one night while slicing roast chicken. I nodded politely, but something in my chest tightened. A few days later, Lena came into my room holding a folder. Inside were bank forms, a notarization page, and a printout of my investment account. She sat down beside me on the bed. Her tone was careful. She said they just needed a short-term transfer, said they'd return it within a few months, said it would help secure their future and the kids. I asked her how she got access to my account information. She smiled, but her eyes didn't. She said she'd always known my passwords, said she needed to check in on me sometimes. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me. Something had cracked open. I thought about my late husband, Thomas, how we'd saved for years, bit by bit, never touching the principal. I thought about the time I loaned Lena $5,000 to fix her transmission, and how she never paid it back. I realized I had moved into a house where love came with conditions. By the end of that second week, I stopped leaving my bedroom door unlocked at night. Looking back now, I wonder if any of you have ever felt that shift too, when a hug becomes a transaction, when kindness turns into currency. If you've ever trusted someone so much that you moved into their home only to feel the walls close in, then you know what I mean. And if you haven't yet, stay with me. Because what happened next would split everything wide open. And once that curtain got pulled back, there was no pretending anymore. Not for me, not for them, not for anyone. By the start of the third week, things shifted from subtle to obvious. I noticed it first with the grocery receipts. I always offered to pay for what I used: milk, bread, my special chamomile tea. But one afternoon, Lena left a receipt on the counter, circled items in red ink, and wrote a total beside it. Then she added a sticky note: "Your share. Thanks." No greeting, no smiley face, just a number. Later that evening, she handed me a printed breakdown of the monthly utilities, highlighted and organized into columns. She pointed to my name at the bottom and said, in a calm voice, that fairness keeps things clear. That's how families stay strong. Mark didn't speak much that night, but he did nod in agreement while scrolling on his phone. I didn't argue. I walked upstairs with the paper in hand, sat on the edge of my bed, and stared at the math. The total wasn't outrageous, but the message was louder than the number. They didn't want a mother in their home. They wanted a tenant. A few days later, I found Mark in the kitchen, flipping through a small black notebook. When I entered, he closed it too fast. He set it on the counter and smiled like nothing happened. Later that night, when they were out, I checked the drawer where I kept my personal folder. It was slightly out of place. The tabs had been shifted. Some documents weren't where I last left them. I didn't need proof to know. I had seen enough over the years to trust my instincts. Something was unfolding behind my back. The next morning over breakfast, Lena casually brought up estate planning. She asked if I'd ever considered simplifying my accounts. Said she read that joint accounts were easier for emergencies. Then she mentioned her friend's mother, who had put everything in a trust for her kids, so there were no questions later on. I didn't respond. She kept talking. She said it wasn't about money. It was about clarity, about preparing for the future, about peace of mind. Mark added that he could help with paperwork if needed. He'd done it for clients. He had templates. He could make the process smooth. I looked down at my cereal. The milk had gone warm. The spoon felt heavy in my hand. That same afternoon, I called my financial advisor from my car. I didn't want to speak inside the house. I told him to set alerts on all transfers, block any changes, and flag activity from unknown IPs. He asked if everything was okay. I said it was a precaution, just in case. By the end of that week, Lena handed me a packet of documents. She said she had gone ahead and drafted a sample transfer of authority just to get the ball rolling. Her tone was casual, like she was offering me a cookie recipe. Her eyes, though, stayed fixed on mine a beat too long. I didn't open the packet. I set it aside and asked her how the kids were doing in school. She didn't push further, but 2 days later, Mark brought it up again. This time, while we were alone in the garage, he said Lena was just trying to help, that I was lucky to have a daughter who cared so much. Then he said, with a smile too smooth, that money only creates drama when people get secretive. I stepped around him, walked back inside, and locked my bedroom door behind me. That night, I reviewed every single account I had. I changed passwords. I wrote down the names of people I trusted. I scanned and saved backup copies to a flash drive I hid inside the lining of my suitcase. I didn't sleep much. I wasn't afraid yet, but I had begun to prepare. It wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. And this pattern had shown itself before. I just hadn't wanted to see it until now. The third week blurred into the fourth, and with it came an eerie shift in the house. It was in the way Mark's footsteps grew louder down the hall, in how Lena stopped knocking before entering my room, and in how the grandkids were suddenly too busy to spend time with me. Small isolations built slowly, then all at once. It began the morning I found my medicine organizer in the wrong drawer. I had placed it under my bed like always, but that day it sat on top of my dresser, open. The Tuesday slot was empty, even though I hadn't taken anything yet. I didn't panic. I didn't accuse. I just tossed the pills and started a new set from my travel stash. I began carrying my essentials in a zipped pouch that never left my side. I stopped leaving my coffee unattended. One afternoon, I overheard Mark in the backyard talking too loudly into his phone. He was pacing near the shed, his voice sharp. I couldn't catch every word, but I heard him mention equity, consolidation, and legal guardianship. The tone alone told me enough. Later that day, Lena asked if I would mind signing a few forms for her refinance. She said it was just a routine update. I asked her why my name was listed as co-owner of the secondary mortgage. She paused just long enough. Then she said it must have been a clerical error. In that moment, I realized I had underestimated just how far they were willing to go. That night, I pulled out the manila envelope I kept hidden beneath the lining of my suitcase. Inside were old records from Thomas's accounts, notarized copies of my trust, and a full list of my assets. Everything had been kept separate since he passed. That was always our plan. Mark and Lena didn't know that my name had never been attached to the Iowa house. They assumed I had nothing but the condo and my retirement account. But the truth was, I still had access to a diversified portfolio, some of it offshore. I wasn't rich, but I wasn't dependent. The next day, I visited the bank quietly. I asked to speak to manager-level staff. I presented my identification and initiated a full review of recent access attempts on all accounts tied to my social security number. There had been 2 failed login attempts from an IP address tied to Mark's business. I asked the manager to set the highest security level, biometric access, in-person-only changes, and voice-verified transactions. She didn't ask questions. She just nodded and got it done. I returned home before sunset. Dinner was already on the table. Lena served roast pork with overcooked carrots. Mark asked how my day had been. I said I went to the park. He nodded, satisfied. That night, I barely slept, not from fear, but from a growing sense that something inevitable was about to crack. And it did. Days later, I woke to find my room ransacked. My suitcase was unzipped. My drawers were pulled open. Even the lining of my coat had been torn. My flash drive was gone. I stood silently in the doorway, my heart pounding, then walked downstairs. Lena was in the kitchen. She didn't look up. Mark stood by the refrigerator, arms crossed. I asked if anyone had been in my room. Lena said maybe. One of the kids went in looking for scissors. Mark said maybe I had misplaced something. They said it too quickly. I didn't respond. I went back upstairs, closed the door, and picked up the landline hidden behind the bookshelf. It was a burner line, something Thomas and I had used years ago when dealing with a real estate scam. I dialed a number I hadn't called in a long time. My lawyer's assistant answered. I gave her the code word. She transferred me immediately. Within minutes, my attorney confirmed he could lock everything down. I asked him to trigger the failsafe in my trust, remove any shared power of attorney privileges, and notify my offshore custodian that fraud had been attempted. I also asked him to make a preemptive report to Adult Protective Services, not an accusation yet, just a record. Then I packed a small overnight bag, only essentials. I didn't run. I didn't cry. I simply acted. That evening, as I came down the stairs, I saw Mark standing by the fireplace, holding my flash drive. He didn't say anything. He looked smug. Lena stood behind him, her expression unreadable. I told them I was going out for a walk. They didn't stop me. At the corner of the block, I got into a black sedan waiting for me. My attorney had sent a driver. We drove straight to a safe location. I had arranged years earlier, a small house in Ames, deeded in the name of an old college friend who owed me a favor. The next day, I froze all joint assets, placed a fraud alert, and transferred everything into a protected, irrevocable trust. For the first time in weeks, I slept. Not deeply, but without looking over my shoulder. The silence in the safe house was different. It didn't echo like the big house. It wrapped around me like a warm coat. I could hear my own breath again. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of peppermint tea, reviewing the documents my lawyer had sent. Every page had a purpose. Every signature I made pulled another piece of my life back into my hands. Over the next few days, I stayed in that quiet house with the curtains drawn and the phones silenced. I didn't watch the news. I didn't scroll. I just thought. I thought about how it got this far, how two people I had once held as newborns, Mark and Lena, could turn so calculating, so cold. On the fourth morning, I received an email from the bank. There had been another attempted login using outdated credentials. Then a call from my lawyer confirmed all assets had been moved. The structure was untouchable. The successor trustees I had named years ago, 2 retired professors from my reading group, were now legally in charge if anything ever happened to me. That afternoon, I spoke with the lead investigator at Adult Protective Services. A quiet inquiry was already open. I gave them everything: documents, photos, timelines, every detail of the manipulation down to the hour. I wasn't pressing charges yet, but I wanted a record. The officer was patient and precise. She didn't offer false comfort, but she did say something I hadn't heard in a long time. She said I had done the right thing. She said I wasn't alone. Later that evening, I returned to the city, not to their house, but to my friend Petrus's home. She greeted me with open arms. No questions, no judgment, just a hot casserole and a clean guest room. While I was there, I finally let myself feel the weight of it. The betrayal wasn't just about money. It was about erasure. They hadn't tried to steal my accounts. They had tried to erase my autonomy. But they failed. When the letter arrived from a law firm representing Mark and Lena, the tone was sterile. They expressed concern over my disappearance and requested a voluntary meeting to discuss a revised estate structure. They claimed I might be under undue influence, referenced my age, my supposed confusion. I handed the letter to my lawyer. He smiled slightly, highlighted every loaded phrase, and drafted a firm response. He included proof of my legal capacity, recent cognitive evaluations, and the full documented timeline. He copied Adult Protective Services and the Federal Oversight Board. The next day, a detective from the Financial Crimes Unit contacted me. The bank had linked the login attempts to a broader pattern of elder exploitation. Mark's name had surfaced before. Lena's too. 2 days later, I sat across from the detective and told him everything, not just the mechanics, but the emotional sabotage, the passive remarks, the silence, the slow stripping away of independence disguised as concern. When he asked if I would testify if needed, I said yes. That week, I signed a formal affidavit, confidential for now, but ready. My final action was symbolic. I renamed the charitable fund Thomas, and I had created years ago. It was no longer tied to a date. It now carried my grandmother's name, the strongest woman I ever knew. I restructured it so that each year, grants would go to women over 60 who had survived financial abuse within their families. I didn't need revenge. I needed meaning. By the end of the month, I officially relocated. Petrus helped me find a 2-bedroom condo in a quiet neighborhood with wide sidewalks and tall oaks. I unpacked slowly, placed Thomas's photos on the shelves, and framed the trust certificate with my grandmother's name at the top. I made tea that evening, stood at the window and watched the wind move through the trees. I had lost a family, yes, but I had also reclaimed something I didn't know I was missing: myself. 2 weeks passed. I kept to myself, living quietly in the condo Patris helped me find. No social media. No phone calls unless necessary. The days were still and healing. I began walking again each morning just before sunrise, with no music in my ears, only the sound of gravel underfoot and the birds waking up. Then the letter arrived. It came from the probate court. It had been sent to my old address, but redirected by my lawyer. Inside was a petition filed by Lena and Mark, requesting a formal hearing to declare me unfit to manage my estate. They were invoking the Elder Concern Act, claiming I was mentally compromised and being isolated by outside parties for financial gain. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so cruel. Attached were signed affidavits from 2 of their friends, people I had met no more than once or twice. They spoke of my confusion, of my supposed forgetfulness, of an incident at a family barbecue where I allegedly asked the same question 3 times. It was laughable, but it was filed in court, which meant it was now public record. I met with my attorney again. He didn't flinch. He had expected this. He laid out a plan, clean and calm, just like he always did. We would respond with documentation, my evaluations from Dr. Kirsch, my cognitive assessments, and sworn statements from my financial advisor, 2 neighbors, and 3 members of the church committee I had served on for years. These people had known me far longer and more intimately than Lena or Mark's planted witnesses. But there was something else, something unexpected. The detective I had met with weeks earlier reached out again. They had uncovered surveillance footage, not mine, but bank cameras. 2 separate attempts by Mark to access accounts tied to my name, each time using documents that had been flagged as altered. Alone, it wouldn't result in charges, but paired with the pattern, it built a case. They were preparing to bring it to the district attorney. That same evening, I sat down with Patris and told her everything. I hadn't shared all the details before. She listened without interrupting, then offered something I hadn't considered. She suggested I write a letter to the court myself, not just a legal response, but a personal one. Speak as a woman, she said, not a client. Let the judge hear your voice before they ever see your face. It took me a day to decide. Then I sat down, pen in hand, and wrote longhand first. 4 pages, not just facts, but feelings. I wrote about my childhood, about raising Lena, about her curiosity, her laughter. I wrote about the moment I realized she had changed. I described the silence between us that grew louder over the years, and I explained, simply, that protecting myself was not cruelty, it was clarity, and it had come far too late. My attorney typed it up and submitted it with the response packet. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Those weeks passed with a strange stillness, not calm, but suspended. I didn't hear from Lena or Mark, not a word. But the local papers picked up rumors of the probate filing. It was a small city. People whispered. Old friends called. Most left voicemails. I didn't return them. Not yet. On the morning of the hearing, I wore a navy suit I hadn't touched since my husband's funeral. I brushed my hair smooth and pinned it back. I carried no bag, only a folder with my name on it and a heart that had learned not to shake. Courtrooms are colder than they look. I sat beside my attorney. Lena and Mark were on the other side. Lena wouldn't look at me. Mark did once, then turned away. The judge entered. The hearing began. Their attorney spoke first. He painted me as disconnected, volatile, prey to manipulation. He used words like isolated, withdrawn, emotionally unstable. Then he introduced their witnesses, the same two people as before. They spoke vaguely, heard from someone else, saw something once. Then it was our turn. My attorney introduced the evaluations, the statements, the timeline. He walked through the pattern of control and coercion, then placed my letter into the record. The judge read it silently at the bench. When she looked up, she said only this, that it was rare in her courtroom to see such clarity from someone being accused of incapacity. She dismissed the petition without delay. She called the filing not just unfounded, but an abuse of process. She referred the matter for further review. We walked out without a word to Lena or Mark. There was nothing left to say. Back home, I made tea and sat on the balcony for the first time. The sky was wide and pale gold. The air smelled like rain. Later that evening, I received an email from a small women's advocacy group. Someone at the court had passed along my letter. They asked if I would speak at an upcoming forum, not about the legal case, but about resilience, about reclaiming identity, about surviving quiet betrayals. I closed the laptop. I wasn't ready yet, but the thought stayed with me. The week after the hearing, something inside me shifted. It wasn't relief. Not exactly. It was something quieter, more hollow, like standing in a house that had been emptied out. The echoes weren't loud, but they were everywhere. I had won, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like walking away from a battlefield alone, carrying only the silence of what was lost. That weekend, I stayed in. Patris dropped by with groceries and a few tulips. I didn't say much, and she didn't press. She just sat beside me while I watered the plants and cleaned out the kitchen drawers. It was the first time I truly noticed how still my hands had become. No tremble, no tightness, just a slow steadiness, like something was finally settling. That night, I opened the storage box I had carried from the old house. Inside were photos, journals, and a leather folder holding all the old letters Mark had sent me in college, his childish penmanship, his jokes, his promises to take care of me when I got old. I stared at one letter for a long time. Then I quietly set it aside. I pulled out my own journal, the one with no lines, the one I hadn't written in since the year after my husband passed. I turned to a fresh page and wrote a single line. I am still here. I wasn't sure what I meant exactly, but the words felt real. Days later, I met with my lawyer again, not because I had to, but because I wanted to talk through what came next. Not legal steps, personal ones. He mentioned the trust, the Lena fund, and that the first round of grants could be released within months. Applications were already coming in, women of all ages, stories of loss, survival, quiet reinvention. Then he asked if I wanted to remain anonymous. I thought about visibility, about having your name attached to something someone else might cling to in their darkest hour, about standing up, not in spite of what happened, but because of it. I told him no. I wanted my name on it. That evening, I walked through the neighborhood and past a park with pale blue benches and children running in circles. I sat for a moment, letting the late light hit my face, and thought about Lena, not with anger, not even disappointment, just stillness. She had made her choice. Mark had too, and now I had made mine. Back home, I made tea and opened a blank document on my laptop. For the first time in years, I began writing my story not as a case, not as an article, but as a life, mine. It began with the same line, I am still here. And from there, the words came like water. Weeks after choosing to go public with my name on the Lena Fund, a letter arrived from the office of a federal investigator. It was addressed directly to me, not through my lawyer, not through any legal channel. Hand-signed, tidy font, no red tape, just a quiet sentence at the bottom. They were reopening the inquiry into Mark. My fingers didn't tremble when I set the letter down. I didn't feel fear, just a tightness in my chest that told me the past wasn't finished with me yet. The next day, I met with the investigator. He looked far too young to be holding such power, but his eyes were patient. He explained that several suspicious financial transfers had been flagged in the broader investigation into elder exploitation in our county. 2 names kept recurring, Mark and Lena. I listened. I gave them what I had. But more importantly, I gave them what no one else could. The story behind the numbers, not a rant, not a list of grievances, just facts, calm and sharp as glass. How Lena had slowly gained access to my digital accounts. How Mark had pushed me to sign over power of attorney without giving me time to think. How I had once believed this was normal, loving, even. The investigator leaned forward. He told me they had subpoenaed the bank for voice recordings tied to wire transfers. In one of them, a man identified himself as my son-in-law, using my full name and social security number. The problem was the voice wasn't mine, and the permission had never been recorded. The wheels of justice were turning now, and I was no longer the only one hearing the gears grind. That night, I sat alone in the living room with every light off, just the hum of the refrigerator in the next room. I didn't cry, I didn't shake, but I felt it the low hum of reckoning. It didn't taste like vengeance. It tasted like gravity. Days later, Petra stopped by. She brought a binder, thick with reports and recommendations from the board we had quietly assembled for the Lena Fund. They wanted to expand more applicants, more outreach, a partnership with a university program that trained women in digital literacy and finance. I read through the proposal and paused at a paragraph buried near the end, a speaker series. Women over 60 sharing real stories of rebuilding, quiet battles, and silent triumphs. They had penciled me in. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. That night, I sat on the balcony again. The air was thick with early summer heat. A siren passed 2 streets over. I didn't flinch. I thought about what it meant to speak, not whisper, not journal, but speak. And not just for myself, but for the hundreds of other women I had read about in the fund's early applications. Stories filled with disbelief, gaslighting, financial erasure, betrayal dressed up as care. My story wasn't rare. That was the hardest part. It was common, silent, ordinary. That silence needed to break, so I agreed. 2 weeks later, I stood in front of a small gathering in the basement of the local library. Folding chairs, coffee in paper cups, no microphones. I told them the truth, not everything, just enough. I told them who I was, that I had raised a daughter I loved with everything in me, that I had watched her walk away, not in one loud moment, but in 100 quiet choices. I told them about Mark, about the bathroom floor, about the silence that followed, but mostly, I told them about waking up, about the day I realized survival was not the end goal, that dignity mattered more than peace, that no inheritance, no bloodline, no shared last name could ever outrank the voice inside a woman when she finally said enough. There was no applause, no cheering, just silence. But it wasn't the silence of shame. It was recognition. Afterward, a woman named Alois took my hand. She was 72. Her daughter had taken her home equity line and vanished. She hadn't told anyone until that night. Her voice cracked as she spoke, but she didn't stop. And I realized then this was the true legacy. Not the fund, not the courtroom victory, not even the name I had cleared. It was the fact that somewhere in that room, a woman had breathed easier because I had spoken first. By late summer, the name Lena Fund began to circulate quietly through nonprofit spaces and retirement communities. Nothing flashy, just momentum. I spoke again, this time at a women's center in Greenville, 40 minutes from my place. They had printed small flyers, just my name, a time, and a title I hadn't chosen. Speaking Through Silence. The title sat heavy in my chest the entire drive. The room was warm when I arrived. Fluorescent lights. Coffee already brewing. I sat in the back while the organizers adjusted the chairs. I wore a blue knit top, cotton slacks, and the silver watch Mark had given me years ago. Funny how I still wore it. not for sentiment, just because it told time well. When it was my turn, I didn't rehearse. I stepped forward and told a different shade of the truth. This time, I spoke about what came after, about sitting in your own home without waiting for footsteps behind you, about cooking for one without guilt, about paying your own bills and feeling grateful for the quiet click of confirmation. I saw women nod. One reached for her purse to dab her eyes. Afterward, a woman named Judy, 68, asked if she could walk me to my car. Her story unfolded slowly, but I recognized the rhythm immediately. A daughter who took over her finances, a son-in-law who handled the paperwork. Suddenly, she couldn't access her own checking account. She whispered that she had no one else to tell. So I gave her a number, not mine, the center's, and told her to call in the morning. She held the paper like it was a lifeline. That night, I couldn't sleep, not from nerves, but from the weight of it all. Stories piling up like fallen leaves, each one rustling with the same ache. For the first time, I wondered if I was strong enough to keep holding space for them. The next morning, I made oatmeal and stared out the kitchen window. The air was still. Something was shifting again. 2 days later, my lawyer called. The federal investigation had moved forward. Charges were being finalized. Multiple counts, identity theft, elder abuse, financial coercion. Mark's name was listed. So was Lena's. The news didn't shock me, but it still stung. Then came the press request. A journalist from a respected outlet wanted to feature the Lena Fund in a national story on financial abuse against seniors. They asked if I would go fully on record. I asked for a day. I walked for hours through streets I hadn't visited in years, past the post office, the old community theater, a bakery now selling vegan muffins and lavender tea. The world had changed while I was busy surviving inside it, but now I was standing in it. So I agreed. The article came out a week later. My name, my face, a photo of me standing in front of the library, sunlight catching the edge of my hair. The headline was simple. She spoke up. There were no angry calls from Lena, no letters from Mark, just silence. And this silence felt earned. The following week, a young woman from a local university reached out. She wanted to intern with the Lena Fund. She said her grandmother had been one of the first applicants and had cried when she received the acceptance letter. I said yes. That afternoon, as I updated grant paperwork and budgets, I realized something startling. I hadn't thought about Lena or Mark in hours. Not from fear, not from pain. I simply hadn't thought of them. They had finally stopped living in my head. And that, more than any court ruling or headline, felt like the real beginning. The day the letter arrived, I had just come back from the hardware store with a new light bulb and a bottle of vinegar. I saw the envelope on the porch table, cream-colored, thick, no return address, just my name written in sharp, deliberate handwriting. I knew it immediately. It was Lena's. My fingers didn't tremble as I opened it. Inside was a single page, just a few sentences. She said she'd heard about the Lena Fund, that she'd seen my picture in the article, that Mark had told her they had made mistakes, that now he wanted to make peace. They wanted to meet for dinner. Just a quiet evening, just to talk. She had included a location, a restaurant in a part of town I hadn't been to in years, not far from the courthouse, actually. The timing was casual, Friday at 7. I placed the letter down and went to boil water. I didn't need time to decide. I wasn't going, but I didn't tear it up either. I let it sit for 2 full days, untouched, next to the kitchen clock. I suppose I wanted to understand why I wasn't angry anymore, why the invitation didn't sting, why the silence inside me felt so firm. By Friday afternoon, I had forgotten the letter completely. It wasn't until the sun began to fall and the light outside shifted to that strange gold hue that I remembered. 7 o'clock. Then, at 7:18, my phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again, and again. Finally, I picked up. It was a nurse from the emergency room. Lena had been admitted with chest pains mild, but enough to trigger a full workup. They had found her listed as next of kin. She had written my name. I sat on the edge of the bed, phone pressed to my ear. I could hear voices in the background, machines beeping, the muted urgency of a hospital corridor. For a moment, the air around me seemed to shrink. I asked if she was stable. The nurse said yes. Then she paused, said Lena had asked for me, said she was alone. I didn't answer right away. I looked down at my hands, the veins, the thinning skin, the marks of time that hadn't been there once. I thought of the woman who had dragged me by the hair, who had slammed the front door in my face, who had made me feel invisible in my own home. And then I thought of the little girl who used to fall asleep on my chest every Sunday afternoon after church. The one who cried when she lost her stuffed elephant. The one who braided my hair with tiny fingers and whispered that I smelled like lavender and paper. So I went, not because I forgave her, but because something in me needed to see her as she was now. The room was quiet when I entered. She looked smaller than I remembered, her hair tied back loosely, an IV dripping beside her. She opened her eyes and blinked. For a moment, there was no recognition. Then her mouth moved. She said my name. I didn't speak. I pulled the chair closer and sat down. The nurse nodded and closed the door behind me. We sat in silence for a while. Then Lena said she had read everything, the articles, the statements, the interviews. She said she hadn't realized how far she had gone, that she hadn't known what she had become. That Mark was the one who kept pushing, that she only wanted to protect what they had built. I listened. I didn't respond. Then she asked something unexpected. She asked if I had meant for the Lena Fund to be a message to her. I shook my head. I told her it had never been about revenge. It was about reclaiming breath. Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She said she couldn't undo what she had done, but she wanted to start again. Not as mother and daughter, not as anything labeled. Just two people who once shared something true. I stood then, not abruptly, just slow and measured. I told her I didn't hate her, but I also told her I didn't belong to her anymore, that my peace didn't depend on her remorse. And then I walked out. Outside, the sky had turned navy. The parking lot buzzed with motion. I exhaled, not relief, something deeper. I had looked into the eyes of the woman who once broke me, and she no longer held any power. That night, I made soup. Not because I was hungry, but because I wanted to taste something warm and quiet. I lit a candle, not for prayer, just for the calm flicker. And for the first time in years, I slept through the night without waking once. The morning after, I brewed a stronger cup of coffee than usual, the kind that clings to your throat a little longer. I stood by the window, watching the postman pass by with familiar rhythm. But that day, he didn't stop at my mailbox. He crossed the lawn and handed me an envelope directly. It was from the office of the United States Attorney. I closed the door and sat down before opening it. My fingers moved steadily. Inside, my heart wasn't afraid. It was ready. The letter confirmed what I had quietly hoped for. Federal charges were being brought against Mark: fraud, coercion, financial abuse of an elder. Dates, filings, testimonies. My name appeared more than once, not as a victim, but as a key witness. There had been an anonymous tip submitted to the IRS months earlier. The audit had uncovered enough to trigger a broader investigation. Apparently, I wasn't the only one Mark had tried to manipulate. The truth was unraveling. But then I reached the part I hadn't expected. The anonymous tip had come from Lena. I read the line again. Slowly, she had turned him in quietly before the dinner invitation, before the hospital visit. She had done it alone. I didn't know if it was guilt, fear, or something else entirely. Maybe it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had cracked open the very house she had helped build. I placed the letter down and looked at the stack of seed catalogs by the window. Spring was near. The soil was thawing. I thought about tomatoes, about trying again. A week later, a federal officer came to my door. Plain clothes, a real badge. He said my testimony would help expedite the case. Said Mark's tone had changed when he realized Lena had cooperated. No arrest yet, but the arc of consequence was bending. After he left, I sat in silence for nearly an hour. I didn't call anyone. I didn't text. I walked slowly through the condo, touching door frames, the edge of the table, the kitchen drawer that stuck when it rained. These were the pieces that held me. The ones they never touched, the parts they never stole. That night, I turned on the television not to watch, just to hear voices that didn't cut. Then I reached for my journal, the one I started the week I left their house. I opened to a blank page and wrote not about them, but about me. about my spine, my silence, my pulse in the early hours when I walked barefoot through the hallway without fear, about the slow unfurling of dignity after it had been buried for years beneath someone else's version of family. I didn't need justice to look like sirens and handcuffs. I only needed them to know that I survived, and that I did it without their permission. When the phone rang later that evening, I let it go to voicemail. It was Lena. Her voice was low. She said Mark had left the house, that federal agents had come earlier that day, that he had packed a suitcase and slammed the door without looking back. She said she didn't know where he went. Then she said she was sorry again, but it didn't sound like an apology this time. It sounded like release. I didn't return the call. Instead, I stood up, walked outside, and breathed in the air, cold but clean. I wrapped my shawl tighter and listened to the leaves whisper. No one screamed. No one banged doors. No one stood behind me. For the first time in a long while, I was exactly where I wanted to be, and in the quiet hum of a world still turning, I smiled, not from triumph, but from peace earned. Days after I let Lena's call go to voicemail, a letter arrived from my attorney. I almost didn't open it right away. My mornings had become sacred again. I took my coffee slowly, let the sun roll across the wooden floors without rushing it. But something about the envelope tugged at me. It was thick. I opened it carefully and sat down as I read. Apparently, months earlier, before the confrontation, before the dinner, before the bruises, I had signed a document I didn't remember. It involved consolidating assets into a trust. I remembered Mark talking fast, printing papers from his computer. I thought I had reviewed everything, but this one had never truly passed through me. The trust transferred nearly $1 million from my brokerage account into a holding entity under Mark's name. The transfer hadn't completed only because of a bank alert triggered during a flagged request, one that came in while I was at the hospital. The letter continued. My lawyer, following a hunch, had cross-checked timelines. Lena's name had been added to the trust, but conditionally. It would activate only upon my official declaration of incapacity. I felt the chill settle through me. My own daughter had signed documents assuming I would one day lose the ability to speak for myself. She had built a future on my absence, and Mark had guided the pen. But that wasn't the worst part. The letter ended with a handwritten note. My lawyer had legally compared the trust's preparation dates with my medical file. The dates aligned with my fall. The fall I thought was an accident, the bruise on my neck, the dizziness, the medication I didn't remember taking. The dots connected easily. They had tried to incapacitate me quietly, slowly, legally. They had anticipated resistance, but not survival. Now, the entire paper trail sat locked in a manila folder under time-stamped logs that made denial impossible. I walked outside after reading the letter. The wind was sharper than usual. I welcomed it. I needed something real against my skin. I sat on the back steps and pulled my sleeves over my hands. I thought about the meals I cooked for Lena when she was young, about the quiet years after her father died, how I went back to work at the college admissions office just to keep things moving. She never knew what I gave up. She was never meant to, but the woman she became didn't just turn away. She waited for me to disappear. She signed her name to it. Mark had planned everything like a chess match, believing I would never see the checkmate coming. He underestimated the one thing that mattered. I had lived through worse. That chapter of my life was closing, not with screams, not with courtroom drama, but with a woman on her back porch, coffee held tighter, pulse steadier, dignity intact, because survival isn't loud. It's quiet, powerful, absolute. It was a Thursday morning when I walked into the courthouse alone. No makeup, no jewelry, no rush. The documents were already filed. My attorney had handled everything. Still, I came. I wanted to feel it. The clerk recognized my name and nodded quietly. The annulment of the trust was approved in chambers. The frozen funds were returned. The invalid power of attorney was nullified. My full legal name, untarnished, was reinstated as the sole authority over my life. There was no applause, but something inside me finally exhaled. Outside, I sat on a bench across from the courthouse steps. The sun felt warmer than it had in weeks. I sipped tea from a small flask and let the calm settle. A woman passed by, older than me, pushing a small dog in a stroller. Our eyes met briefly. I nodded. For a moment, it felt like she understood, not the details, just the weight of surviving something and still standing. When I got home, I didn't go inside right away. I walked to the potting bench. My hands needed soil. That afternoon, I planted 3 trays of pansies, purple and white. Hardy things. They don't look like much at first, but they survive frost. They come back even after the cold tries to erase them. A week later, Mark called. I let it ring. He left a voicemail, said he was sorry, said Lena wanted to talk. I deleted it. Days later, an envelope arrived. No return address. Inside was a photo, Lena younger, holding her daughter, smiling. I held it briefly. I didn't cry. I didn't throw it away. I placed it in the desk drawer, the one I don't open often. The one that holds things that matter, but no longer define me. I'm not angry anymore. Not exactly. There's a silence now, not absence, but clarity. Like a room cleared of echoes that never belonged. And in that silence, I found something else. Peace. Not the kind that comes from justice, but the kind that comes from choosing yourself, from reclaiming breath, voice, place. I no longer live in reaction to what they did. I live in response to who I became. If this story reminded you of someone who tried to silence your worth, know this: it is never too late to take your voice back. Have you ever walked away from someone you loved to protect the part of you they tried to erase? Your story matters too.